Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what time of day you're listening to part one of pruning. No, I don't expect master gardeners or newbies or master gardener trainees to be up in the trees, but it's awfully good to know about how to prune trees, shrubs, and palms properly here in the state of Florida. So, what is pruning? Let's take a moment here to pause and write down some of your thoughts. Take a few seconds. You're writing something down, aren't you? Come on, get that piece of paper. It could be a back of an envelope, it doesn't matter. So, what is pruning to you? I'm sure a lot of you wrote down shaping. Some of you may have written down control height. Some of you may have said make it look prettier, or things like that. But pruning is wounding. Always remember that. Pruning is wounding, but it can stimulate plant growth for the positive or for the negative. It depends on how you prune your plants. That's not pruning. That's not pruning either, although a lot of people see that and even ask for that. That's topping or hat racking. I'm not sure what they were thinking about with this poor tree. Maybe they play football or something in their yard and needed a goal post. But when you get to a plant and you have to cut that much of it off to have anything remaining alive or green, I think there's only one pruning cut left in this particular plant. That's right at the base with the chainsaw. You see all these pictures all around on the internet. Obviously, it's an older picture from further north. But again, we see this throughout the country, and I'm not sure what people are thinking. Are they that emotionally attached to that particular, I'll use the term tree, or is it just the trunk, to the point where they feel the need to keep it somewhat alive? I'm not sure. How many pruning cuts do you think Jim would say is left to do? You got it. One right at the base. And if it's going to resprout a whole bunch of offshoots from the root system, we would paint that with the appropriate herbicide. usually containing what's that active ingredient? Think about it. I would go with triclopyr. Now, for one tree, I may think of glyphosate, but triclopyr is my herbicide of choice for this. Crepe murders. Crepe myrtles. But we call them crepe murders so often down here because this seems to be the most common way to, quote, prune, unquote, crepe myrtle trees. I never saw this technique till I moved to Florida in the early 90s. I was asked to prune some myrtles at my place of business at the time. I'll keep that kind of on the down low for this recording. And I was asked to prune them, so I did remove some cross branches, some, wiry growth, some little this, little nip, a little tuck, so to speak. And when I was done, you could see I'd taken some stuff out and overall maintained the shape of the natural shape of the tree. My boss came out and said, "I thought you were going to prune the crepe myrtles." I said, "Well, I did that earlier in the day or the day before." And he said, "No, this is how you do it." And he grabbed a huge loppers and cut everything down to stubs like you see in pictures like this. Now, if you notice, the average crepe myrtle tree is pruned at roughly 6 feet in height. Have you ever wondered why that is? Well, here's my theory. This is about the height the average man can lift a chainsaw and walk across from tree to tree to tree. So that's why it's at approximately 6 feet. Now, if you're a little shorter than that, it may be a little lower. Why do we even crepe murder 'em? Well, I have a principle that I think you'll find very important to remember. I call this monkey see, monkey do. A lot of people are unfamiliar with crepe myrtles because they came from other parts of this country that just can't support their growth because it's too cold over winter. And they come here not sure what to do, told by the neighbor, who's also from Wisconsin or somewhere else, how to do it, and this is the shape we end up seeing. I don't consider this pruning. It's a form of butchery, maybe even plant torture. So what do you think is going to happen to these trees in another couple, 3 or 4 years from now? They'll probably be pruned to look like goalposts. But again, somehow we insist on planting large-scale trees underneath power lines and other telecommunication lines. This is a predictable outcome. Someone's going to butcher these trees back into submission. A much better choice would have been choosing more small-scale trees that would never obtain that height at maturity. I'm not sure why we don't think of that first. And then there's some unwritten rule in the plant planting scheme of things down here that thou shalt not plant any plant more than 3 feet off the footer of any structure, including trees in some cases. Some of these small postage stamp home lots that we see much more commonly in the last 20 years or so in Florida are good proof of this. And who do you think is going to take care of it in this particular building? A professional or the custodian? Probably the custodian, who probably doesn't have a whole lot of horticultural knowledge under his or her belt. So let's look at this tree in a Spring Hill yard that was given to me by a local resident when I was up in Hernando County as horticulture agent. And he brought this in and said, "What do you think of my tree?" And how many of you would want this in your front yard? Look at that beautiful shade it gives. The grass isn't too bad considering. I guess apparently enough light can get underneath the canopy to keep a reasonable stand of turf, but it's thinning here and there. Nice big head of leaves, nice and green uniformly, and I would rather have that shade in summer than anything else, as would most people. So let's get back to why we prune. Most of you probably put down shaping or some other thing like that. But here are some more important reasons to prune. Codominant leaders. What do you mean, Jim? That means there are more than one trunk vying for attention on the tree at one time. These can be very problematic, sometimes the weakest link. We have branches that rub together, thus removing the bark and exposing the vascular system to dehydration and death. Water sprouts are more problematic in fruit trees than anything else. A branch can break for various reasons, so that could be a hazard. You may have an out-of-place branch that's dangling and hitting you in the head when you try to walk from your car into the house. Look at the sucker. Um, we see this on naturally multi-stemmed trees like crepe myrtles. Uh, they're not designed to be a single trunk tree, but are trained to a standard form. And these standard forms will keep on suckering for several years until apical dominance is established by the rest of the canopy. They may even continue to sucker for years after apical dominance is established, but not at significant frequency versus when they were young. Also, some of our trees are grafted. We've talked about that a little bit in botany, and you'll talk about that in plant propagation, but we're marrying a root stock to the top, a desirable cultivar of a particular plant, whether it's little gem magnolia, for example, or a citrus tree, or for that matter, another fruit-bearing tree that's good for Florida. So we marry the root stock to the top, which is called a scion, S-C-I-O-N. You'll hear that term in plant propagation, and you also see it spelt out there. But again, the rootstock usually does not have desirable fruit. Has desirable root characteristics only. Then we prune to adjust or shape in some cases to raise the canopy so you can get equipment underneath easily, or if it's a street tree you can get cars and trucks to pass without hitting in the roof or damaging them. Occasionally we'll thin the canopy, but when I hear people wanting to thin the canopy, I bristle because it's rarely done right, and usually it's in the vain attempt to grow turf underneath a large tree. Generally that won't work in the long term. Flowering. We don't think of pruning as for flowering purposes. But again, as I said, what was pruning? It's wounding. But it also can stimulate plant growth, sometimes for the positive. Certain plants, when pruned properly, will bloom more. Other plants, when pruned improperly or at the wrong time of year, won't flower very well. Spring flowering plants pruned too late in the summer will fail to bloom the next spring, for example. I think this is one of the last points of the slide of two that I want to really emphasize. A lot of people never write down why we prune the word safety. This should be at the top of the list. Generally speaking, this is the last thought people will eke out if they write down a list of why we should prune. This should be the topmost thing. Why would we want to prune for safety? Well, if it's near a driveway, if something happens, it could hurt somebody or damage a vehicle. If it's in a public space, like a parking lot, someone could get hurt and, well, there's going to be a lawsuit. You know that. Also, there may be hazards in the tree that we can't see from the outside, hollowing areas or rot for that matter. And here's the final point about pruning. Never prune if you don't know why. A lot of people are out there shaping and doing stuff, and you ask them, why are you doing it? I don't know. I was told I should shape it a bit. Shouldn't I? That's not a good idea if you don't know what you're doing. So what's wrong with this picture? Yeah, I know, I saw it right away too. No safety glasses, no hearing protection, and no gloves. Those are personal protective equipment. Obviously, this is a bit of a pun from the picture, and you would never start a chainsaw this way, but I'll give a little story that happened across the street in my neighborhood in Brooksville. The neighbor was up in one of the very large oak trees that is on his particular property. And he's up there with no safety equipment, no hearing protection, no eye protection, no gloves, and a cigarette's hanging out of his mouth. You kind of get me going like there's a cigarette hanging outside my mouth, and he's starting to pull the chainsaw up in the branches of the wiggling tree. I sat there for a few minutes and I looked out the window and I grabbed my cordless phone and kept it right by my side for about the next 20 minutes of watching him chainsaw on this tree and just reaching over, overextending himself, being a little off balance, a little slippery. It was a very scary thought. A chainsaw is a very dangerous tool if not used properly. Again, use these with the utmost of caution and safety. Here's something that can happen to trees that you may not think about. Look at the picture on the left-hand side. A lot of people will call and say, "Oh, I see a little hollowed out area at the base of the tree." Is that cause for concern? In general, the big answer is yes. That small hollowed out area is probably hiding a much larger cavity that goes from the base up into the tree, as you can see in the upper right hand picture. And you can see that that tree is fairly hollow from the base several feet up the trunk in the lower right hand photograph. In other words, the structural integrity of this tree was compromised. Now, from an external view, it may be very hard to tell how deep or how extensive this is. There are techniques that can be used. For example, taking a stick and trying to poke up the hole there. Low tech, but very effective. If you're going up several feet up there, you know that tree is probably in a bad condition. As I like to say, time is no friend to any organism. So why we prune? I'll talk about controlling size, shape, promoting flowering in those trees and plants and shrubs that do, and removing of dead wood. Now, this is called a spalier, very hard to maintain and very hard to really keep do well in Florida for our very hot climate. That wall would be very hot. This is typically a European style of pruning and designed to grow something like an apple tree or a fruit-bearing tree or flowering plant in a very small space in these enclosed courtyards. Of course, in England, does it ever get above 75 degrees and blazing sun? pretty rare. Again, this is something I would generally not recommend, but this is a technique. It just is very highly ornamental. Of course, we recognize this fellow. Studio. Oh yeah, MGM Studios. There we go. So we prune things into whimsical forms. This is topiary. Obviously, this is not for the general average person to maintain. These usually prove to be a fairly high maintenance type of pruning. Let's talk about some tree botany, hazards in healthy trees, how to remove branches, pruning trees, pruning shrubs, and pruning palms. Pruning concepts that I find that are very important and you should know very well by the end of these modules today. Keep this in mind. Young trees can tolerate, young shrubs too, can tolerate pruning better than older mature trees. I guess plants are a little bit like us. We like change less and less as we get older and older. I guess I'm the only one out there in the internet land experiencing that? Maybe not. Anyhow, a young tree, we can remove maybe up to a third of the leaves and the plant tissue. In mature trees, we recommend no more than 20%. But when do people start thinking about pruning trees? Usually when they're older and don't like being pruned as much. Large pruning cuts will have a more negative impact on a tree than smaller cuts. which are usually less than 3 or 4 inches in diameter. Think about removing a limb that's the diameter of a pizza. That's a very large cut. Remember, pruning is wounding. Trees do not heal. Plants don't heal like you or me. Only thing they can do is seal that area. There's nothing we can do to aid that process. It has to be done naturally by the plant with its own defensive chemicals that are naturally inside the plant. Pruning is wounding. It's also very stressful. It removes stored food reserves, the wood, and the food producing capacity, the leaves. So if you remove a lot of them on a mature tree, it's kind of like a crash diet. Proper pruning cuts will not stimulate excess growth and branch formation. Notice how I said that. If we prune plants properly, we may actually reduce our workload in our gardens. This is another important point I made earlier about pruning for safety. Prune for structural strength, not appearance. A bad way to think about pruning is I want to make it look shapely. You want it to make it look to be strong. Pruning paint, that guck that comes in a can, the black stuff. It may spray on, it may have a brush in the lid of the cap. You know what I'm talking about. If you have such a product at home, please pause this slide recording in a moment, go to the shed or wherever you store it and throw it in the garbage can. Currently, there is no research that indicates any kind of pruning paint or other substance applied to the cut or the wound will aid in sealing of the tree. So, get rid of that pruning paint. So we should think of plants kind of like we do children. When do you start to teach them please and thank you? When they're ready to head off to college or when they're starting to first talk? Exactly. We don't wait till they go off to college, but a lot of times we wait to start pruning trees or shrubs for that matter when they're overgrown, old, woody, something like that, and wonder why they respond negatively. So it's best to start training trees and shrubs when they're young. That man's here about the tree. Should have called me sooner. Let's look at these particular trees. Can you tell what species they are? Of course you can't. It's kind of a rhetorical question. But does it matter? In this case, not really. Do you think these are young for their age for this particular species, old for their particular age, or at least on the mature side of things? Yeah, they're probably on the mature side of things, maybe getting old. It's hard to tell. Now, look at that pruning cut on the right-hand tree. That's awfully large. What is our rule of thumb for mature trees? What is the maximum amount we want to remove at any one time? 20% is correct. So what percentage of the leaves and the wood tissue did we remove? Of course, we don't have the before photograph, but we can pretty much guess by eyeball. We probably removed at least a third, if not maybe even closer to almost half of that particular plant. Now, will this plant heal? Trick question. But as I told you early on in this class, that all my questions are trick questions, correct? I did tell you that. Anyhow, the point I'm really trying to make is no, trees, plants do not heal. They only conceal. Now, something this large may take many, many years, maybe a decade or more. Meanwhile, disease-causing organisms can attack that cut area for a very long period of time. So let's talk a little bit about pruning equipment, and here's a diagram of many different things that are out there. Oops, went the wrong way, but this is live TV, so to speak. Then there are pole pruners. These are designed so you can work on the ground and do pruning on branches and limbs higher up in the canopy. As you can see in this particular model, it has a blade, and that has a wing nut near the red hook as you go down, and you can see it has a red hook. That red hook is a lopper blade, and it's designed the blade lifts up from the handle portion up to the jaw of the lopper. Now what I find is when you have the saw and the lopper all together, that hook gets in your way all the time. So usually we don't use this in combination, but you would remove the saw blade when you're using it as a pole lopper and put on the saw blade when you're using it as a pole saw. I find this designed to have a lot of compromises and flaws to it though. I'm not a big fan of them. So here's advertising for one particular brand, and here's a guy neatly dressed. Pants are nice and clean. He's not sweating. He's got gloves. He got safety glasses. All nice and pretty tree, and he's trying to remove some branch up there in the canopy. Well, that's the advertising of it, right? Here's kind of what happens in reality, I find. What happens is it's very hard to get an undercut first with a pole saw, and what has happened is a person just bypassed that and started cutting on the upper side of this particular branch. The weight of the branch also pulled down with the bark into the stem or major limb of this particular tree. Now, will this area heal? Right, it'll only seal, not heal. So this is permanently wounded. Eventually this plant may or may not seal over. Meanwhile, this is a large wound for infection to start brewing. How can you fix this? You would have to remove the whole limb further back into the tree to really ultimately fix and prevent disease spread in this particular tree. And here's a shot of a tree. I think it's in Hawaii. But look at these guys trying to. One, I love the guy on the left. He's like, "Oh, don't stay back," you know. This is dangerous. Well, he looks real intimidating, huh? Look at the poor guy with the long pole saw. Can you imagine how much that was wiggling and moving? And what kind of good pruning cut do you think he was getting on whatever tree this is? It's probably not a very good cut. It's probably a very rough cut. Probably very wounding to this particular poor tropical tree. I feel sorry for that tree, I'll tell you. So there are various saws on the market. Let's look at the one on the left-hand side. That is a folding saw. I love having this in my pocket folded up, of course. You knew that, right? I can carry that around when it's folded up in my pocket, and it won't cut you. And it's very easy to pull it out of the handle, lock it in place, and cut out branches. What's nice about this banana-shaped handle, the red handle, is that it gets into very small, tight places very, very easily. And it removes a fairly decent-sized branch, maybe about 3 or 4 inches across. Of course, that takes a bit of time and patience with a saw that short. These also come in longer blade lengths that don't fold. They come with the banana-shaped handle frequently, as you can see in the left-hand picture. They also come in a D shape, where your hand fits inside like a loop. The D-shaped is very good for people who have gripping or arthritic issues with their hands or their wrists, like carpal tunnel syndrome. It's a little less stressful to your hand and wrist. A lot of people purchase a bow saw. That's the one on the right hand side. It can fell a tree if you get a big enough one, trust me, and they're plenty sharp. I do like them to do a lot of heavy duty grunt work. However, the supporting structure above, that bow shape, gets in the way of doing better pruning jobs. More often than not, I find this particular saw frustrating when doing average or regular pruning. I only relegate it to taking down larger trees. Like I said, it really can take down a huge tree. Look at that young lady taking down a big tree in a log felling contest somewhere that I stole years ago. And look at the two guys off to the right hand side going, wow, look at, you really can take down a huge tree with that saw. I always thought this picture was particularly funny. Ah, the hedge clipper. What I call and have dubbed the weapon of mass destruction. Yes, I said that. The weapon of mass destruction. This has destroyed the form and function of more foundation or shrubs around American homes than any other particular pruning instrument of torture. I mean, of use. Usually these are not used by people in the proper manner. Now, in this particular picture, you can see the blades are straight across. you'll see some models that have wavy blades. The idea of those wavy blades is that the plant material won't kind of scoop by the blades as much. Well, if the branches or limbs are scooching by your hedge clipper, maybe the plant's trying to tell you, hey, this isn't the right way to prune me either. So I don't like those wavy designs for another reason. They're very hard to sharpen. These straight-edged ones are easy to sharpen with a bastard file. Yes, that is a proper term, and yes, that is a type of file that you can find in a hardware store. If you ask for a bastard file, it's because it's different than the rest and it's great for sharpening hand equipment. You can even sharpen lawnmower blades if you know what you're doing. This was my father's weapon of mass destruction choice, the electric or gas-powered hedge clipper. I particularly hate the electric ones because more often than not I see people with them out there, and there is black electrical tape in several places on the cord. Think about this. This can be a dangerous tool out there if you cut the cord. If I were to have one for professional reasons, I would go with a gasoline model. Now, years ago, I will tell you a story about my father. He liked plants to be either shaped like a meatball, a pyramid, or a box. I've always particularly hated those forms, plus they are hard to maintain. You have to be out there constantly fussing with them. Kind of like if you've ever had a flat top haircut, guys. Or if you know of a guy that has a flat top haircut or has had a flat top haircut. It's constantly getting your hair cut, usually about every 2 weeks or maybe more frequently if your hair grows quickly. And that can be true of shrubs. They grow very quickly in Florida. So one year when I was probably in my middle teenage years, Dad said, prune the hedges while I'm gone at work. So I got out the hand clippers, and one by one by one by one, I did what I was supposed to do according to the way to do it properly. And it looked really quite nice. You could hardly tell that I was out there, cutting them back and whacking them back like the biennial or however often we did it routine when I was younger. Well, Dad came home and said, I thought you were going to prune the shrubs. I said, well, I did, Dad. I was out there all day. Well, I can't tell. Well, my feeling about a good pruning job is it should be subtle. Well, my father had different feelings, and he got out the electric head shears and butchered it all back into submission. To which I looked at him, I said, never ask me to prune the shrubs again. I never did. Let's end part 1 of pruning. Join me in part 2 for more fun.